is that the worldly life is a positive phase of human existence in which God's unity of purpose is to be realized. This has become one of the dominant themes of all renewalist, reformist thinkers and intellectuals. And Asad writes, and I quote again, "Of all religious systems, Islam alone declares that individual perfection is possible in our earthly existence. Islam does not postpone this fulfillment until after a suppression of the so-called bodily desires, as a Christian teaching does, nor does Islam promise a continuous chain of rebirths on a progressively higher plane, as is the case with Hinduism, nor does Islam agree with Buddhism, according to which perfection and salvation can only be obtained through an annihilation of the individual's self and its emotional links with the world. No, Islam is emphatic in the assertion that man can reach perfection in his earthly, individual life and by making full use of all the worldly possibilities of his world." Let me go on to this quotation from Asad, also in this book, in Islam at the Crossroads, and this time on the spirit of the West. I quote here, the real intellectual foundations of the modern West are to be found in the old Roman conception of life, the Roman Weltanschauung, if you like, as a purely utilitarian proposition without any transcendental outlook. Indeed, the powerful scientific and material achievements of modern Western civilization emerge out of Europe's age-long intellectual fight against the Christian church and its outlook on life, unquote. In the Islamic worldview, the first and foremost objective is the moral progress of man, and therefore ethical considerations overrule the purely utilitarian ones. With its aversion to transcendental ethics, the moral basis of modern Western civilization, in the judgment of Asad, is incompatible with Islam. Islam believes that the superiority, Asad believes that the superiority of a culture or civilization, quote, does not consist in the possession of a greater amount of material knowledge, though the latter is most desirable, but in its ethical energy. His advice to those educated Muslims who continue looking towards Western civilization as the only force that could regenerate their own stagnant civilization is summed up as follows, and I quote, "If we wish to preserve the reality of Islam as a cultural factor, we must guard against the intellectual atmosphere of Western civilization, which is about to conquer our society and our inclinations. By imitating the manners and the mode of life of the West, the Muslims are being gradually forced to adopt the Western outlook, or the Western worldview, if you like. For the imitation of outward appearance leads by degrees to a corresponding assimilation of the worldview," and this is his word, "responsible for that appearance." I'm going to skip all the other pages just to keep within the time limit. Let me just go on to the road to Mecca. And again, I'm going to highlight a few passages which support my contention that his major contribution to Islamic thought is his articulation of Islam as a worldview. And he's among the first to do that. I would say next after Iqbal. On page 205, my own observation had by now convinced me that the mind of the average Westerner held an utterly distorted image of Islam. What I saw in the pages of the Quran, K-O-R-A-N, was not a crudely materialistic worldview, but on the contrary, an intense God consciousness that expressed itself in a rational acceptance of all God-created nature, a harmonious side-by-side of intellect and sensual urge, spiritual need and social demand. It was obvious to me that the decline of the Muslims was not due to any shortcomings in Islam, but rather to their own failure to live up to it. Page 206. The Quran pointed to the harmony of the stars and their movements as witnesses of their Creator's glory, and thereupon the sciences of astronomy and mathematics were taken up by the Muslims with a fervor which in other religions was reserved for prayer alone. The Copernican system, which established the Earth's rotation around its axis and the revolution of the planets around the sun, was evolved in Europe at the beginning of the 16th century. But the foundations of this system had actually been laid 600 years earlier in Muslim countries. For already in the 9th and 10th centuries, Muslim astronomers had reached the conclusion that the Earth was globular and that it rotated around its axis, and had made accurate calculations of latitudes and longitudes, and many of them maintained, without ever being accused of heresy, that the Earth rotated around the sun. Page 207. In short, Islam gave a tremendous incentive to cultural achievements, which constitute one of the proudest pages in the history of mankind. And it gave this incentive by saying yes to the intellect and no to obscurantism, yes to action and no to quietism, yes to life and no to asceticism. Little wonder then that as soon as it emerged from the confines of Arabia, Islam won new adherents by leaps and bounds. Born and nurtured in the world contempt of Pauline and Augustinian Christianity, the populations of Syria and North Africa, and a little later of Visigothic Spain, saw themselves suddenly confronted with a teaching which denied the dogma of the original sin and stressed the inborn dignity of earthly life. And so they rallied in ever-increasing numbers to the new creed that gave them to understand that man was God's vicar on earth. This, and not a legendary, quote, conversion at the point of the sword, unquote, was the explanation of Islam's amazing triumph in the glorious mornings of its history. It was not the Muslims that had made Islam great. It was Islam that had made the Muslims great. But as soon as their faith became habit and ceased to be a program of life, to be consciously pursued, the creative impulse that underlay their civilization waned and gradually gave way to indolence, sterility, and cultural decay. Let me just end with the last quotation from his book, and this happens to be also entitled The End of the Road. Let me read, and bear with me because it's quite a long quotation. Never before, I reflected, have the worlds of Islam and the West come so close to one another as today. This closeness is a struggle, visible and invisible. Under the impact of Western cultural influences, the souls of many Muslim men and women are slowly shriveling. They are letting themselves to be led astray, to be led away from their erstwhile belief that an improvement in living standards should be but a means to improving man's spiritual perceptions. They are falling into the same idolatry of progress, into which the Western world fell after it reduced religion to a mere melodious tinkling somewhere in the background of happening, and are therefore growing smaller in stature, not greater, for all cultural imitation, opposed as it is to creativeness, is bound to make a people small. Not that the Muslims could not learn much from the West, especially in the fields of science and technology, but then acquisition of scientific notions and methods is not really imitation, and certainly not in the case of a people whose faith commands them to search for knowledge wherever it is to be found. Science is neither Western nor Eastern, for all scientific discoveries are only links in an unending chain of intellectual endeavor which embraces mankind as a whole. There was a time when the civilization of the Muslims was more vigorous than the civilization of Europe. It transmitted to Europe many technological inventions of a revolutionary nature, and more than that, the very principles of that, quote, scientific method, unquote, on which modern science and civilization are built. Nevertheless, Jabir ibn Hayyan's fundamental discoveries in chemistry did not make chemistry an Arabian science, nor can algebra or trigonometry be described as Muslim sciences, although the one was evolved by al-Khwarizmi and the other by al-Battani, who preceded Copernicus by several centuries, and both of whom were Muslims. Just as one cannot speak of an English theory of gravity, although the man who formulated it was an Englishman. If, therefore, the Muslims adopt, as adopt they must, modern methods in science and technology, they will do no more than follow the evolutionary instinct which causes men to avail themselves of other men's experiences. But if they adopt, as there is no need for them to do so, Western forms of life, Western manners and customs and social concepts, they will not gain thereby, for what the West can give them in this respect will not be superior to what their own culture has given them and to what their own faith points the way. End of quote. Now, I think what we need to do after all this adulation of Asad's ideas and his great message of the Quran, although I find that when I want to get a more spiritual insight from the Quran, then I would read Abdullah Yusuf Ali. And to me, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, Muhammad Asad are the yin and yang of Quranic commentary. You can't do with Muhammad Asad alone. You need also Yusuf Ali to help you to whet the spiritual appetite. I think we need to do, and I hope Prof. Tariq is in the best position to do that, I think because he met the man and he is a European Muslim, and he probably is another gift to Islam. I think what we need to do is also to contextualize Asad's ideas and not to forget that Asad, like all great thinkers, were also products of their time. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.